Hello, my name is Sesay, and in today's video, we're going to discuss continuous lights versus strobes, which is better and when, the pros and cons of both. So, which should you buy if you're on a budget? And let's go over the top things you need to consider from power, portability, and light shaping capabilities. I'm going to look at a few different categories and rate them from 1 through 10. I'm excited to see the comments light up to see whether or not you agree with me or not. So first, I want to talk about power. To test this, I want to minimize any of the benefits from reflectors or the beam angle. So I used a book light, setting up a V-flat world V-flat, and also putting one on top to contain the light more. Then I put a full grid cloth in front of them to diffuse the light even more to make the comparison as fair as possible. I chose this setup because it's a real-world setup for interviews and portraits as well. Not 100% scientific, but very real world. Now let's shoot some stills using both and see what the power difference is here. Here is a shot with the LED. My camera is set to ISO 100 f2 at 1/125th of a second. And here is a ProPhoto D3 with the camera set to ISO 100 f11 at 1/125th of a second. So we are looking at a 5-stop difference. The difference between shooting at f2 and f11. So a 500 watt second strobe is equivalent to about shooting a 16,000 watt LED. I believe a 5,000 watt LED is the most powerful on the market right now, so that says a lot for strobes. So your 500 watt second strobe would be set to power 5 or 1/32nd power if measured in fractions to compare with a 500 watt LED. So how would this compare to a speed light? Most large speed lights are approximately 75 watt seconds. So a 500 watt LED would be equivalent to a speed light at power 8 or a quarter power. Now, one thing to remember is when using bicolor or RGB LEDs, oftentimes they're not as bright as compared to an LED that just has a fixed color temperature. For the test, I lowered the strobe modeling light to about 10%, so it didn't add to the overall exposure by any measurable amount. When it comes to power, strobes win by a huge amount. It's the difference between shooting at f11 versus f2.0 or ISO 100 versus ISO 3200. 5 f-stops. So when it comes to power, strobes get a score of 10 and LEDs get a score of only 2. Remember, we're just talking about photography here, not video yet. But one reason I would prefer strobes here is I like the flash of strobes telling my subject I just took a photo, versus me having to give verbal commands for each pose because music was drowning out the sound of the shutter when using continuous lights. But still, for this first of many tests, the strobe scored a 10 and the LED scored a 2. Now, with that power difference, can you use continuous lights outside? Well, obviously, but how does it compare to using strobes outside? My next score is going to be about overcoming ambient light. So for this test, I'm going to use a similar style reflector on both. I have full sun hitting the background with my subject shaded by a tree. Here is a shot before, and here's a shot after. I was able to easily balance the continuous light with the sun in the background hitting the grass and over the model's shoulder. I was shooting at ISO 100 f8 at 1/125th of a second. So even on the brightest of days, the 500 watt LED can act as my key light or fill light at the distance that I have it at and with the reflector that I'm using. And here is a series of images where a cloud came over and I lost 2 stops of light, in which now the continuous light is more than enough as it started to overpower the ambient light, meaning reading at a higher exposure than the ambient light. But let's use a 500 watt second ProPhoto B10 Plus. Now I'm shooting at ISO 100 f32 at 1/125th of a second, and the ambient light is just about gone, and the light metered at f32 and 6/10 of a stop, so we are still very close to a 5-stop difference. So outside, the strobes get a 10 and the continuous lights get a 1. The reason this score was so drastic is simply because you get more creative control outside using strobes than you do continuous lights, and you still have this massive power difference. Now, we can't go outside without talking about portability. With all the different size 500 watt second strobes and 500 watt LEDs, I'm going to give strobes a 10 and LEDs a 1. I had to deduct points because the ballast on most 500 watt LEDs is the size of another light, although there are many options with no ballast, but there are also some outlier 500 watt second strobes that are very small as well, like the ProPhoto B10. I deducted a point because with a ballast, there is more cabling, and that adds to the overall amount that you have to carry. The massive amount of point deductions here was really because you have to carry two large V-mount batteries or a very heavy portable power station like I was using to power the Nanlite to get it to 100%. Many smaller V-mount batteries will only get it to 50%. So now let's give the LEDs a place to shine, and that will be doing a hybrid shoot when you need to capture both photo and video. Here, I was able to capture a video at ISO 800 at f8, and then easily capture stills at ISO 200, 1/25th of a second at f2. Now with strobes, I'm using a ProPhoto D3 that has a 60 watt modeling light, which is the best in class when it comes to LED modeling light for strobes. And when capturing video, in this setup, I was at ISO 800 at f2.8 at 24 frames per second. Now the ProPhoto D3 is an outlier with a 60 watt modeling light. When it comes to video, you're looking at a similar advantage that a 500 watt second strobe has over a 500 watt LED, which is about 4 to 5 stops. I'm going to give LEDs a 10 here and strobes only a 2. I could go higher, but 60 watts is about as powerful as strobes get here. But to be absolutely clear, in terms of my own opinion, if I had to do a hybrid shoot and I had complete control over the location, I would choose continuous lights all day. But many times I bring both just to use the right light for the right job. So currently, the score is 33 to 14 with strobes in the lead. Next, let's judge them based on light shaping. If just comparing a COB LED to a strobe, I would give the strobe a 10 and the COB an 8. I think the flat front will suffer in hard reflectors, parabolics, and beauty dishes, but there are still plenty of options to get the job done. And if we branch outside of just COB LEDs, then LEDs get a 10 and strobes get an 8 because LEDs have so many varieties to choose from tube lights, bulb lights, to light mats, to panels that you just don't find in strobes, plus options for parabolic light shapers like the Parabolics Omni. So if I remove my own bias here from strobes, then I have to rescore LEDs 10 and strobes a 5, especially when it comes to lighting a scene. There are some outlier strobe modifiers that are very expensive and oftentimes get quickly discontinued because of poor sales. But if you had a scene lit completely with LEDs, using tube lights and mats, especially in a small space, it could be difficult to replicate with strobes in the same exact footprint, but my final score is an 8 for strobes and a 10 for LED. I think the variety of fixtures gives LED a clear advantage, even though I personally think a non-recessed strobe head with a fully exposed flash tube is God's gift to light shaping, period. So our updated score is now 41 for strobes and 24 for LED, with my bias playing a large role in the last score. But to be fair, let's remove my bias and score at 38 strobes, 24 LED. So now let's talk about working with color. Well, LEDs pretty much take this one away. With strobes, gels with deep hues like deep reds and purples and blues often lower the power of strobes by 3 to 4 stops. So your 500 watt second strobe is now effectively a 62.5 watt second strobe. And even my jelly roll that I've built over 25 years cannot fully match all the colors built into a modern full color LED. So LEDs get a 10 and strobes, we subtract points because first, available color options. It would be a fortune to even get half the amount of gels that you would need to match what you can find in an LED. We're also going to subtract points for ease of use. You can easily just dial in the color on an LED light versus having to tape a gel in order to get the color to change. And when it comes to color correcting to a scene, it can be very difficult and you have a very limited amount of options to perfectly match a strobe to a scene versus just simply being able to dial in the color temperature and the green and magenta of a LED to get a more perfect match. But I'm gonna give some points back to strobes due to their very high color fidelity. But sadly, 9 out of 10 times, you probably won't see it, especially when shooting stills. So strobes get a 2 and LEDs get a 10 when it comes to color. So now LEDs are starting to catch up because strobes are at 43 and LEDs are at 34. At the end of the day, they're all lights, period. Simply use the best light for the job. Don't think you have to decide between the two. Maybe you want a mix of both. Now, I did leave out freezing motion because although strobes feel like the obvious choice and they do have the greatest potential to freeze motion, when I was outside, I did this shot at ISO 100 at f4 at 1/4000th of a second. By going to ISO 1600, I could have been shooting at 1/64,000th of a second, and once we move into more powerful LEDs, the game changes a bit. So it really comes down to which one is better for the job, depending on exactly what your situation is. Maybe there's an entirely separate video just going over stopping motion, strobes versus continuous light. But in this test, we talk about power, portability, hybrid shooting, light shaping, and working with color. So my final score, 43-34, with strobes being the clear winner, based on power, portability, hybrid shooting, light shaping, and working with color. I would love to see your scores below. As a professional commercial and portrait photographer, you're inevitably simply gonna wanna own both. If I was forced to choose, I would start out with strobes for their power and portability. If you wanna see how I've used LEDs for a photo shoot, check out this video in which I review the Godox light mods. So what I really want you to do is create a list of criteria. Find out which lights work best for you. And remember, like, subscribe, and drop a comment below on why you use one over the other or both. And remember, there are levels to this.